All right, guys, by now you should have already finished the warm-up, and I'm going to go over the answers with you. You'll notice that we kind of have the arrangement a little bit differently because I'm going to be working with different groups today. So if we look at this, we need to remember that multiplication and division are opposite operations. Therefore, when I add, I can technically change that into subtraction or subtraction into addition. And when I multiply, I can technically change it into division or division into multiplication. And that's what we need to do with fractions. When we multiply or divide fractions first, we need to make sure that the numbers are either as proper fractions or improper fractions. So for number 1, we can keep 1/12 the same. For some reason my pen didn't want to work. Here, let's try that again. And we're going to divide that by, well, we need to change this to an improper fraction. How do we do that? The denominator times the whole, because that means I have a total of 9 thirds to equal 3, plus one more third would give me a total of 10 thirds. I'm going to change back to my blue. Remember, the rule for division is to keep the first fraction, switch the sign to multiplication, and then flip or take the reciprocal of the third fraction. So we're going to keep the 1/12, switch the sign to multiplication, and flip the second fraction. Before we multiply, we need to ask ourselves, is there anything that I can cross cancel? And yes, there is. You should notice that 3 and 12 have a common factor of 3. 3 divided by 3 is 1, and 12 divided by 3 is 4. Go back to blue. And now we can multiply across, and that gives me 1/40th is my final answer. And you should notice something, that 1/40th is a lot smaller than my original number of 1/12. And we're going to look at that again in just a minute. All right, let's look at number 2. Again, we have to have proper or improper fractions. So we need to change the second number to an improper fraction, so we're going to multiply 9 and 3, and that's 27. Plus 5 is 32. All over the common denominator, the denominator of 9. We need to keep the first, switch the sign to multiplication, and flip the second. Before we multiply across, let's see if we can cross cancel, and we can. We can cancel the 2 because it's even with the 32. 2 divided by 2 is 1, and 32 divided by 2 is 16. And we can cross cancel the 3 and the 9. 3 divided by 3 is 1, and 9 divided by 3 is 3. And now we're going to multiply across. So we have 1 times 3 is 3, 1 times 16 is 16, and our final answer is 3/16. And although this one isn't as obvious, 3/16 is smaller than 2/3. And again, we're going to look at that in just a second. For number 3, our first number is the mixed number, so we have to change that to an improper fraction. So 2 times 10 is 20, plus 1 is 21 tenths. And we're going to divide that by 1/2. We're going to keep, switch, and flip. Again, before we multiply across, let's see if there's anything we can cancel. And 2 and 10 are both even. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 10 divided by 2 is 5. So now we can multiply across because 21 and 1 can't reduce any further, and that gives me 21/5, which we're going to change back to a mixed number, 4 and 1/5. Now, what do you notice different here? That I divided by a number less than 1, and my answer is bigger than the original number. I divided by a number greater than 1, and my answer is less than the original number. Same here, divided by a number greater than 1, and my number is less than. And if you remember from scaling, it was the complete opposite because we were doing multiplication. All right, please turn to the second page. And I want you to take a minute and it says, match the following expressions with the correct diagram. Please write the expression and sketch the diagram in your composition book. And I'd like you to pause the video right now and do that. Take a couple minutes and get this sketch. This one, I'm sorry it doesn't show all the way, but it should be 3 wholes divided into 3 parts. Okay? Take a minute. All right, now that you have everything sketched, let's go through and see what all this means. Number one, what does it mean? It means if I have a whole, and that whole is divided into thirds, and then I take those thirds and I divide them into three parts. How much will each one of those parts be equal? Or in other words, how many parts will there be? There's 9 parts, so each one is equal to 1/9 of the whole. Okay? So I took 1/3 and I divided it into 3 parts, and therefore each one of them is equal to 1/9. And my drawing here is just a little bit different. Sorry if you're going to have to erase. So I took my thirds and I divided them into 3 parts, and each one of these is equal to, make sure I have a different color than red, 1/9 of the whole. Okay? Number 2, I have 3 wholes, and that is represented by C, and then I divide that into 3 parts. How many parts do I have? Well, if I take 3 wholes and I divide each one into 1, 2, 3 parts, I have a total of how many parts? 4, 5, 6, and I'm sorry that the screen got messed up. This should be 7, 8, and 9 continued. So this should look like 3 wholes, and then I take each of those wholes and I divide them into 3 parts. And then that would give me a total of how many parts? 9. 9 total. And that's represented by letter C, and this one was represented by letter A. And then B, or number 3, you should notice, obviously this one's going to be B. Some of you will remember that we did this last week. If we take 3, and we multiply it by 1/3. So we have 3 wholes, 1, 2, 3 wholes, and we divide that into thirds. So this whole thing is 1/3, 3/3 down. This is 1/3. So if we take 1, 2, 3, and we divide into thirds, how much do we have? 1 whole, or 1. All right? Does that make sense? All right. Let's go ahead to the next page, and we have some essential understandings here. When you divide a fraction by a whole number, you're finding what? All right, go ahead and pause it and think about it. All right, when you divide a fraction by the whole number, what are you finding? You're finding how many times the fraction fits into the whole. And if you need to pause to write that down, go ahead. I want to go back to the previous page so that you can see that real quick. If I go back and I have 3 divided by 1/3, what I'm trying to find out is how many 1/3 fit into 3. If I have 1/3 divided by 3, as you see in number 1, I'm trying to figure out how much each part will equal, and there's 1/9. How do I explain that better? Okay, each part is equal to 1/9. When you're multiplying a fraction by a whole number, so please go ahead and write that statement down, and then we'll answer in just a second, so go ahead and pause it. All right, let's continue. When you're multiplying a fraction by whole numbers, you are finding piece of the whole because you are multiplying by a number smaller than 1. Or a whole. Remember, a whole equals 1. All right? How can we represent this? Let me get a different color. So if I have a whole, so let's say that's 1, and I'm going to divide that by a third. Or in other words, I'm going to divide it into thirds. Remember, the word into represents division. So if I'm going to take this whole and I'm going to divide it into thirds, so 1 divided by a third, how many pieces did you divide it into? 3 pieces. Okay? Now, when I'm multiplying, let's say I have a whole, and I'm going to take that whole and I'm going to multiply it by a third, you are finding what piece of the whole does that represent. And let me get a different color really quickly. So I have my whole, and if I divide it into a third, well, where they overlap is what it represents. And that represents 1/3 of the whole. Dividing, well, that's going to be 1 times flip 3, because how many pieces did I divide the whole into? 1, 2, 3 pieces. Does that make sense? Now, if you're not sure at the end of this video, please raise your hand and I will come help you, but I need to see before you raise your hand for me to come help that you've written this part down. Now, if you go to the next page, it says please log into my Google Classroom and click on the link for the slides. Please do slides number 2 through 5. Now, I'm going to talk you guys through this at the beginning of the period. You may want to write down what you need to do, but if you have any questions as you're doing this, please let me know.